Welcome to another WebRTC Hacks live stream. Today we'll be discussing OpenAI's WebRTC implementation. If you don't know me, I'm Chad Hart. I'm editor and blogger over at WebRTC Hacks. I've been a WebRTC enthusiast for a long time now. So just a few logistic notes before we begin. One, I'm rebroadcasting this stream to YouTube on an old computer, so that might not be the best. I'm actually using RingCentral Events to broadcast the stream. It's a product I spend a good amount of my time on. So I do strongly encourage you, if you're on YouTube, to use the end-to-end WebRTC experience directly. Just go to WebRTCHacks.com/livestream. You can register. You can jump over here to the fun stuff with everyone in this with a lot more features. I'm going to try to keep my questions to around 30 minutes. And after that, we can take some audience Q&A. Make sure to use a Q&A feature in the chat bar to enter your questions. I'll peek over there occasionally to see if there's a question that's relevant to some of the things I'm discussing, but I'll save a lot of that to the end. And unfortunately, Sean and I both need to get back to our day jobs at some point, so I am going to try to keep this whole thing to about 45 minutes. I'm guessing we might go over a little bit, but we'll see. But I will republish this video with the transcript to WebRTC Hacks. I usually add some annotations and links, so don't worry too much if you feel like you're going to miss something. It'll get reposted. But we have so much to discuss today, and as I said, never enough time. So let's get started. So I'd like to welcome, or really I should say, welcome back Sean DuBois of OpenAI. I'm going to ask Sean to give some background on himself and how he got here. But if you don't know him, he's the founder of the very popular open source WebRTC project Pion, among many, many other things. So maybe to start out, Sean, can you just give everyone a background on what you've been up to in the last couple of years? I think actually the last time, well, at least I had you on a video, at least was at Cranky Geek during the open source roundtable a couple of years ago when you were at Amazon at the time. I know you've done other things, but I'll let you get us to speed. And certainly, I guess, we'll get into how you ended up at OpenAI.
Yeah. So my background is I got into WebRTC because I was at a startup that was doing, I was at Etsy, and WebRTC had just come out, and I thought it was just absolutely magical that you could exchange an offer answer over IRC and do video. The company, Etsy was paying tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to a video conferencing provider. And I was just I've been in love with it since then. And I was doing Asterisk at the time. So my interests bounce all over the place. So I have Pion, which is the open source project that I work on. And then, so it's funny to hear, you say, the founder. There was actually 4 people that started it with me. John Bradley, Noah Schrader, and they all went and did other things, and I kind of just clung on to this thing that started, and I'm still here. And I also want to shout Joe's in the channel, Joe Turkey. There's other people that make the project what it is. So I always I don't know. I just want to give credence to everyone. I'm a very small part of all of this stuff. So I do that, and I work on OpenAI, on the Realtime API, on ChatGPT, anything that does WebRTC. And then I do the embedded stuff. And then the other thing I love is WebRTC broadcasting. So I added WebRTC support to OBS. I have Broadcast Box from my time at Twitch. So sort of disjointed, but I have all these different parts of WebRTC I love. And
Okay. And you were over at LiveKit for a while.
Yep. So I was over
right? Which I guess we'll get into a bit. It's a little relevant since OpenAI using some LiveKit stuff too, right? We'll talk. Well, maybe. How did you end up at OpenAI? I guess other than applying for a job and getting it, was there anything else?
No, that was actually it. There was no one. So I was at Twitch, and then I went to LiveKit, and then at LiveKit I did the SIP stuff and the telephony stuff, and then after that I never found a good fit. I think I kept I got excited about Embedded, and I got all these other things, and I wasn't really doing good by LiveKit. I feel I made them kind of unhappy with my distractions. So I feel I do better at companies that there's room to be distracted. I don't know. And then,
okay, well you like lots of side projects.
Yeah, I like lots of side projects to the displeasure of my bosses. And so then I went back to Twitch, and it was hard because like, the RTMP and the HLS stuff was always bigger than WebRTC, but I really cared about the WebRTC, and so it was hard. I was always like trying to push that forward, but it felt like it didn't have the mind share. And then Dan Jenkins just sent me a link for OpenAI, and it's like, oh, you should apply for this, and I just did. Like, didn't know anyone, cold apply, and I can't tell you how many times I haven't gotten jobs. Like everyone else, I've interviewed at Google 6 times and not gotten it and stuff like that. And so I apply all the time to things with no intention of getting them. And I just kind of stumbled into the job. And then it was cool because my boss at the time was Jason Clark, and it was just me. Like, it was just like me doing WebRTC stuff. Like, just so incredibly fun those first couple. I'm jumping ahead, but yeah. Like,
yeah, no, well, I want to get into that, but I mean, I will say, I thought maybe it had something to do. I mean, obviously, like they use LiveKit. Well, I like to talk about it a little bit more, right? Like, what's the state of WebRTC there? But given your LiveKit background, maybe that would be a natural shoe-in. But maybe that's a good point. All right, so you joined OpenAI. They were already using LiveKit for, well, maybe you can explain it, right? Because one of the confusing things is that there's multiple different WebRTC implementations there, right?
Yeah.
There's on that. I think most people probably have used the ChatGPT advanced voice, so that feature. So I guess there's it looks like there's a stack there. And I should say, Philip Hankey at FIPO, and I helped them do a bunch of analysis and look at all these different things back in December or whatever. Yeah, so there's that stack. There's the old Realtime API, and then there's a new Realtime API with WebRTC, the different parts. But maybe you can just kind of, I guess, walk through how that ended up. Why is there 3 different stacks? And well, to start, what was the state when you started? Because I'm guessing the WebRTC stack maybe wasn't there. But
so when I joined, there was like the LiveKit stuff was already there, and it existed built into ChatGPT, and so that uses all of that. But then Realtime API is its entirely different code base. And you think like Realtime API and ChatGPT, they're both like front ends to using inference and all like the engines and stuff like that. So you can imagine they're like different front doors to the same kind of back end. And so the Realtime API doesn't use any of the LiveKit stuff because it was all WebSockets at the time. It was just like a WebSocket API. It's all written to. It's like a big server that consumes WebSockets and takes that audio and decodes it and sends it to the engine, to the inference engines, and like does all of that logic.
Okay. Are you a fan of the WebSockets approach? I'm guessing no. Since you do the WebRTC, you're a WebRTC person anyway. But like,
okay.
Certainly, Well, I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, I have opinions there, but I'm curious your thoughts on why did they do that?
So when I joined, my initial perception of the WebSocket stuff was confusion, and because I'm like, oh, like you have to write more code to use this, and it requires it doesn't like automatically do audio capture and all these things. The use case that I didn't understand is there's like a faster than real time. So you can imagine like if someone pulls up to like Burger King and they want to order something, that you actually want the speech to text, you want the speech to speech to come back instantly, and then the customer will like run checks on it, because it would be bad if you go and order something and then it responds with something completely different, unexpected. And so there's some use cases where you want just like WebRTC, where it's like video, it's like audio that's flowing in real time, and then and then a lot of use cases are you want it faster than real time, and so it would make more sense to like send it over a WebSocket so you can send faster than speech.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like call center oriented type.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then like you have a lot of customers that are just like, I just want WebRTC. I'm not going to be auditing it. Like I just want the LLMs to go.
Okay. All right. So I guess so you had the WebSocket stuff was there, and then there's where was what was LiveKit? Walk us through, I guess, what LiveKit was being used for.
The ChatGPT. For ChatGPT.
Yeah, for the advanced. So the API was WebSocket based. The ChatGPT advanced voice is LiveKit. I mean, like still is. And I didn't actually do the. I don't know if we checked in the last week or two, but okay. I do want to come back to where all this is going and how it fits, but maybe it's a good point to say, all right, you came in, you built out all this new WebRTC stuff, like. what is the problems you were trying to fix? Like, what did you build? I assume it uses Pion. Well, I mean, I know it does because we talked about it already. But
Yeah.
we'll talk about that a bit, right?
Yeah. So like the first week I was there, I just sat down and did like a little hack project of like putting a Go Pion thing in front of the WebSocket. So it runs entirely separate from the WebSocket server. Like it's just like it was a modular Go process, and I tried to put this modular Go process inside the existing infrastructure. Like everything runs in Kubernetes, and it became very hard to do WebRTC inside of Kubernetes because it's all very HTTP focused WebSockets. So that was like the first week or two is I joined, and it was I was built this demo project, and then I spent a lot of time trying to get it to integrate with the existing infrastructure, and then I realized that if we want to do this, we'll have to probably run it. We'll have to run it outside of Kubernetes if we want to ship it in like the next couple of weeks. So that was like the initial thing that I did when I got there.
Okay. And I assume it worked and you convinced them. And then you basically that ended up with a parallel API, I guess, to the WebSocket one that uses WebRTC.
So my hope is that, yeah, so it's like a parallel API in the sense that like if you know the WebSocket API, that the WebRTC API feels exactly the same, that you can like send, messages over the data channel, and pretty much the only thing you don't have to worry about is the handling of audio anymore. That was my hope, because I would like to see this real-time API extend to anything that people need. Maybe if in 5 years Media over Quick takes over, I want to be able to slot in Media over Quick and not have it be like a big painful transition or like SIP or like any other thing. Like that's my hope.
Okay. So in some of the analysis that mostly FIPO, and I did, well, with the LiveKit stuff, and I guess challenge LiveKit is really meant to. It's like SFU. It's a it's a multi-party type system, and I think the use case here is mostly it's one-to-one, right? You're talking to the LLM, and you give me something back, so it's really more of a straight peer-to-peer thing. Was that like part of the question is why not just use the LiveKit stuff for this too? But I guess did you see the requirements or what? It's just kind of strange. Why start with LiveKit and then go build something new? What were you trying to do that LiveKit? Not to disparage them at all, right?
No.
Why start a second, a third stack really?
So all the business logic of the real-time API was so like the WebSocket. So the WebSocket server that has all this business logic that ChatGPT doesn't have. So like checking API keys, doing like safety checks, doing like all these things. And so then if I went and so I wanted to use the WebSocket stuff that we had already. So I guess like what I could have done is I could have created like a LiveKit room. No, I don't even know how I would have done it, right? Because like if you can imagine, like in this Go Pion server, like I'm just like translating WebRTC to WebSockets. It's like really simple, but I don't know how I could have used LiveKit to do like this WebRTC WebSocket translate, because like it has to occur in a process, and I can't like have the real-time API join the LiveKit room. Like it really wasn't like there was like no consideration of I want to use LiveKit or I want to use something else. Like it was just like I was like racing against the clock to ship the thing because like I just joined a job, and you want everyone to like you, and so you want to build something quick. Like all
right. And no one asked. No one's like, oh well, like why didn't you just do the LiveKit stuff? Like no one.
Everyone's so incredibly busy. Like that's the thing. It's I think like as I've been at bigger companies where everyone's like real dives in on design docs, and you can have like weeks and weeks of conversation. Like here, if you care about something, like you can like change like core features very quickly because everyone's just too busy to ask questions. And I that's why I like it. Like it's nice that like if you care about something, you can go do it, and you're empowered to do it. So so no, like I'm sure, but also it was just me. Like there was no like it was my boss who like was also incredibly busy, and then like I was the only WebRTC person, so like there wasn't really anyone else to talk to.
Okay. is there a scenario where like you would need to do like an SFU multi-party type stuff, or here? I mean, is that? I mean, it could be. I guess you talk to multiple LLMs at the same time, and one of them wins or whatever on the response. But was that part of the design consideration, or?
No, like I imagine someday, like we'll have like you have an LLM joining. Like I saw this with Cloudflare, like that you have an LLM join the conference room so you can ask questions. You can have like multiple LLMs talk to each other. Like there's totally stuff that will come up like that. But I'm telling you, like I don't. It's always funny when people analyze my action, like analyze stuff. Like I didn't think any of this. Like I was just like trying to solve the immediate problem. It's like it was pretty simple in my head.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'd like to. I have a couple like implementation questions about like choices. Right. So one, you have no turn server.
Yep.
Right. And well, I guess you're using TLS, but maybe walk through. I guess why did you do turn server? Right.
It was just like another thing to deploy. So like all I really care about is like how many people can connect to it. And so like if I can offer UDP and TCP support with only having to run one service, I find that preferable.
Yeah,
like
actually, you're using the TCP TLS, right?
Yep.
Instead of a turn server.
And the same with like OBS stuff. Like I was just like, the turn stuff is cool, but if you're doing client server communication, it's like it's another service I have to run. It's like more latency because you have to like run through like another server. I always prefer the ICE TCP stuff just because it like brings down the complexity.
Okay. Well, and I assume you haven't had too many complaints of it not connecting, or you need a turn server in those situations anyway.
Yeah, okay. Like we have metrics of like how many people post an offer compared to how many people go to connected, and like it's never alarmed on like a lot of users like sending offers but not going to connected.
Okay. All right. The next area, I'm curious how you think about optimizing audio, right? Because you're not. I mean, it looked like you're not using Opus DTX. You're not doing any redundancy audio stuff. There's no. I suppose a client could implement client-side noise detection. Maybe you're doing that server side, but I'm curious, how do you think about? All right, you need to get audio. I mean, there's two parts, right? You need to get audio into the LLM, and it needs to understand the audio well enough to like interpret the speech. It probably doesn't have to be perfect, but like there's one aspect, and then you want to hear the audio coming back, right? So you're synthesizing audio and sending it over, and you do want that to be very high quality, right? So yeah, how do you think about optimizing?
So I'm just using libopus via Seago in the server. Like things like DTX and stuff, like I just haven't even considered or worried about yet. Like I'm just like running it through like an Opus encoder and decoder. And then the WebSocket API has crisp. Like you can enable it via like like in the session.update, you can turn on like far field, near field. I forget the exact terms.
Yeah. Okay. So is that some of these audio quality improvement things? Is that something you see yourself doing? I guess you just haven't got to it yet.
Yeah. So the things that I've been most concentrated on, like I just haven't got to it because like it hasn't been burning enough. Like honestly, like most of the time, like the WebRTC stuff is so good out of the box, and like just like WebRTC is like so mature that like people just don't complain too much about the audio issues. Like most people are like having issues with like the LLMs like steering them or like other things. Like most of the effort of the company is not on the audio video transmission. Like I love it. Like it's super interesting to me, but like it's like on the burn down chart, it like is so low below the bar to convince someone that like, hey, this is the thing we need to work on.
Okay. All right. Is there any does the audio maybe the LLM can live with poor audio anyway, at least on the inbound side? Is there any evidence of that? Like maybe you don't care about sending great audio because it doesn't need it.
No, I do care about sending great audio, but when people are like like even with like clear audio samples, you'll have, so like we have these the evals that it'll have trouble understanding numbers or trouble following instruction like prompts and stuff like that. So the people are so much more focused on these other things than the audio quality. Like yeah, I don't know, like I would like to come back to it and do more on it, but if it's just not what people are asking for.
Okay.
Like, and no customers ever come to me and been like, oh, the playback of the audio is really bad or it doesn't understand me.
Okay. All right. Well, the other part, I don't know how many users ChatGPT has now. Like, it's going to be smaller for the API, but it's still pretty high scale service. How do you, I guess, how do you think about scaling this? And I know you, I asked you to draw some stuff.
Oh yeah.
Throw that on screen too, if that helps.
Yeah. So this is kind of like a rough sketch out of, so these like VM, the Pion service that are doing that like WebSocket to WebRTC translation. So user request comes in via a post of like, here's a WebRTC offer, and I have a GeoIP DNS, and I know from like, I have it boxed to latitude and longitude. And depending on what your latitude and longitude is, I send you to a different regional load balancer in Azure. And then, that region then has a bunch of VMs inside of it that like they're load balanced between them. So like I can keep, I can spread the load out between a bunch of different virtual machines. And all those virtual machines then do is like take that WebRTC-ness and convert it to a WebSocket and use like the same real-time API WebSocket that other people are using.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah. Do you is there do you think there'll be a day when you don't need to go through the WebSocket interface and can send out audio more directly?
Yeah. So that is, I have a couple things that we'll need to solve of like how do we get that business logic out of the real-time API WebSocket server, like around like billing and like limits of sessions and safety and recording features. Maybe, but like the question would be like, why? Like if we move that code out, would it give customers lower latency? Like what would be like, I think that's where I'm at, is like, there has to be like a clear benefit. I think there will be eventually, like as like time goes on and these things get more complicated and latency, and it becomes more latency sensitive, it'll be then. But like, if we're talking,
well, I mean, it's not latency. I mean, I'm surprised there's not more latency sensitivity already. But
so
I guess, yeah.
Since everything's like turn-based right now,
yeah,
it doesn't seem like the latency is too big of a problem. And also those, since it's all in the same data center, we're talking like, milliseconds of like there's no congestion, there's not a lot of latency between these servers, like those virtual machines and the real-time API WebSocket stuff, because it's all just sitting in the same data center.
Okay. And I mean, you pointed a couple of things, I guess, what's coming next, but do you have any roadmap plans or anything you can share?
Yeah. So
what's coming up?
The thing that I've been working on recently is that the like operator, like how you like the basically like tell a computer user agent to go like book tickets or like so right now that uses video over WebSockets, and it has like a 7-second latency and all these. So like I'm working on switching that to WebRTC. So that's like
nice
the thing I'm working on. So then and it just uses like an existing open source project called Nico. So,
which one was that?
Nico.
Nico.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe kind of like a screen capture to WebRTC library.
Yeah. So just like does GStreamer, and it does like an X11 grab, and then it like sends the buffers into Pion to send them.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I've only played around with the operator a little bit. Now you got me scared that there's a 7-second latency, but I suppose it's not responding that quick. I mean, I guess like it is kind of slow. That would explain partly why.
Yeah. I think it just comes from like, I don't really know where all the latency comes from of like when it's doing like the VNC over WebSocket stuff today. I never really looked into it. I was just like, I know Nico works out of the box with sub-second latency. Let's just use this thing instead.
Okay. I did want to. I know there's a lot of Pion fans in the audience. I did want to ask, spend a minute or two on what's new with Pion too, and I guess that does relate here because you're using Pion in there. Maybe my first question on Pion: Are you doing things in Pion specifically for OpenAI?
Yeah, I made a couple small commits. Like I exposed you could only get the local candidates, and I added the remote candidate. Like nothing deep. Like it was just like little changes to make stuff easier. And so yeah, like a little bit. I think the biggest things that are exciting for me in Pion right now is that I would really like to see more of the RTP, RTCP stuff come to greater maturity. So it's like the net, before, we use the same SSRC for retransmissions, and then we finally switched to a distinct SSRC, so you could tell is the packet is it a late packet or is it a retransmission that finally arrived? And then it has other issues. So I think that's the biggest is Pion hit this point where you can build anything you want with it, but then the quality of service can be better. There's a very clear gap between standing up, LibWebRTC and Pion, and it's hard to close that gap because it's hard to find developers that want to go do that kind of stuff.
Okay. Anything else I guess on the Pion side you want to talk about?
I'm continually excited about the OBS WebRTC stuff.
Yeah, I mean that was gonna be my next topic, right? I guess that's I think maybe the last time before this recent topic we talked a lot about with the OBS and WebRTC launch. How is that going?
Good. So the Simulcast PR was approved, and I'm just waiting for someone to hit that merge button. I just think it'll make such a dramatic difference if people can do client-side encoding. It kills me. So I'm
okay.
desperately waiting on that one.
I don't want to distract people and put the link in there, but I would say anyone that's interested in at least some more background. I had a post on that Sean helped review, give me insights on. That was 18 months ago now. It's been out there for a little while. I can't believe that no one's done that. No one's done the merge on that Simulcast thing yet.
I don't know why it's so.
I guess just to explain, that's the idea. WebRTC supports Simulcast, where you can send streams of multiple different qualities. And that's expensive to do that server side because then you got to process and re-encode the video. If you could just do that client side, like we're doing now already, and just send those streams, it helps offload the server. I guess in theory there might be some case that it's going to be better quality, or less opportunity for the network to mess things up in between, that sort of thing.
I think there's absolutely better quality because you imagine that it's gonna you send 1080p and then the server decodes it and then re-encodes it, and you have generational loss, you have resizing, resampling happening on the server. That is very frustrating. I'm very frustrated. Simulcast is also better for the user for a security validity standpoint, because I want to get to a point where I'm not sending my video unencrypted through these servers. I want to upload my video and have some kind of off tag, and only then do I know does the video get played out, because I don't want to get to a world where people can insert ads into my video and stuff like that. I imagine some company somewhere is going to be hey, why don't we just start inserting ads in the background of his video, and then that will be the new normal. So I just want to get ahead of that and have this good thing that works for everyone. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I can keep going forever. I do want to have a discussion for a few minutes of what do you about interesting things in WebRTC and where things a little bit. I'll spend a couple minutes on that. But I'm looking at the Q&A, and there actually were a few questions on Quick, media over Quick. Maybe we can talk about that for a bit. And I actually do think that's interesting, because that's that's a potential use case for what you're doing on OpenAI there too. So what are your and you've been involved the media over,
Mhm.
So I guess what's Pion's involvement in media over quick, and what are your thoughts on that initiative?
So I haven't been involved with media over quick at all. And I chalk it up to just my personality. Like I want to build things that are useful to people today. Like I'm a very like hacky, scrappy kind of builder guy. So that's kind of where it's been. And like I just don't have a lot of interest in going and arguing with people about how things are done. Like when I like see like, oh, that like Luke put a lot of effort into this stuff, and then like he like writes a post about like how he's very frustrated with the process. I'm like, I'm very happy I'm not in that same position. Like it does seem, and it's like an admirable process to go build things better. Like I feel that with Pion, that like I want to go build. I'm like very aspirational that I want to go build these things better. But the nice thing with Pion is like no one can stop me from doing that. Like I can just go build, but with like standards and all that, like the politics and the having to work with other people seems very, very frustrating. So that's what keeps me away from it. Sorry, I don't think I really answered. I answered what's Pion's involvement with Quick.
Yeah. Okay. Is the takeaway from that you don't see yourself getting too involved in that until it gets a little further along in terms of
like I think
actual being used in browsers and stuff. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, like if it got to the point where like developers were coming to me and saying like, hey, I want to use Quick and it would be great if I could do this, that, like I would start building something with it. But at this point, I feel like I don't have anything to add. Like I could spend. Should I like stream of conscious answer things, or am I?
Well, I'm not gonna hold you back for anything you want to do. I just put this up because just for context, I guess.
You mentioned
they missed the opening question. I forgot to do it earlier.
So like
you don't need to do that. And I will say I think it should work. If anyone wants to come up on stage and ask live, I opened it up. So I think you just request to come on stage. I'll put you up there.
So I think like people should just build with whatever gets them to where they want to go quickly and in a way that they enjoy. So like if like you can take some Go code and quickly build your application, you should go do it. If you can go take some Rust code and build your application, I feel like a lot of developers, they like push for people to use their thing because not because they care about the user, but because they want to see their thing used. And like Pion was like a response to like frustration that like libWebRTC is the answer for everything. And so I'm not going to sit here and be like WebRTC is the answer for everything. You have to use Go. You have to use WebRTC. Like just use what's best. Like and like there's like all these different things of like maybe in your use case having more control is better for you because you can do the media over quick. But maybe like in other cases where you just want to build something that matches up with what WebRTC is trying to do, it's easier to stand that up. Like so like with my experience with like remote control, it was nice that like Nico existed so I can just go and use it and it uses WebRTC. I don't care too deeply about that. But like if there was something that uses media over quick and it worked really well and I could deploy it easily, I would go with that. Like I don't think about it much deeper than that. And there's no perfect protocol, there's no perfect software. It's just like in this moment, how can you fix things for people?
Okay. I have a related question I've been curious on. You have a family, you have a job, and then like, but there's been you put out a lot of code sometimes. So do you just not sleep, or do you just take time off of work, and how do you do that? Or you're just like a super genius and you never make mistakes in your code.
Wow, you would say it for me. No. I'll disappear from Pion for a little bit at a time. Sometimes I'm not a great employee and I'll go do the Pion stuff. The truth is I'm just trying to live life to the fullest. So like for me, Pion has like served different purposes throughout my life. So like when I first started Pion, I had like really low self-esteem where like I really wanted to prove myself. Like I cared deeply about like I would nag you and Sahi and be like, post about Pion stuff because I just wanted people to like me and respect me. And then when my dad died, like I worked on Pion because it was kind of like cathartic, like a therapy thing. Like I was like kind of like a workaholic on it for a little bit because of that. And then people started using Pion and it became like my job. And now like people use it and like I work on it and it's like part of my identity. So like to answer the question of like why, like how do you like why do you do this stuff? Why do you work on this stuff so much? Like it's like I'm just living life. This is like life for me at its fullest. Like I don't feel a desire to go play video games or do other stuff because Pion, like in this open source stuff. Oh, you know what I'll also tell is like the happiest you'll ever be is like doing stuff for other people. Like I really get lost in doing stuff for other people and like having people use this and help people in Discord and Slack. Like there's not much else. Like this is it. This is my life philosophy of like, I hope to, like wake up someday and be 70 and be like, dang, like I had fun with my kids and I got lost in all this open source stuff. And that was it. Like that's all there is. I don't know, man.
Yeah. Pion is your hobby.
Yeah, that is it. Like, and then the OBS stuff and like, and then like I just get like frustrated and I get obsessed like with the OBS thing. Like I saw that the world could be like, as trite as it sounds, like I can't make the world a better place. Like I'm not, like a billionaire. Like I can't go solve world hunger, but I can like make WebRTC broadcasting a little easier. So like I tell myself like this is what I dive into when I do, and then I try to use Pion to like have as good an impact as possible. So like to get people jobs, to give people purpose. Like I don't know. That's it. There's not much more to it.
All right, thanks. All right, the one question here: thoughts on bridging SIP trunking into OpenAI? Understand the LiveKit has a SIP bridge, but curious if you have thoughts on the telephony ecosystem and AI today. Well, I think that I don't know what you. Well, I'm not exactly sure what you worked on a LiveKit, but I mean you have Asterisk background and stuff too. What are your? Maybe you can comment on this one.
So I did the SIP stuff for LiveKit, and then my hope is that the Realtime API will support SIP eventually. Like I can't promise like roadmaps or timelines or like when I'll find time to do it, but that is like the next thing I think that would help people the most. And then my overall thought, like I'm always frustrated by protocol bridging because there's like information lost. It's like when you bridge like SIP and WebRTC, it's like, oh, like like something like the RTSP means different things across because different software. So I don't know. That's my goal. I just want to make things as easy as possible. So my hope is.
You mentioned that when we were getting ready a couple of minutes before you asked me how I got into this stuff, and I said I work for Acme Packet, and they a session border controller, which is essentially a protocol bridge, right? That's what they do. And I still find it I do find it amazing. Like it's so easy to bridge protocols just to have just go ask ChatGPT like.
Yeah.
Well-defined thing here. That's very easy. You just go map it, right? Like, and I'm still amazed that we're still doing a lot of this protocol bridging.
We got to, otherwise we're going to lose our jobs. This is like all I get paid to do. Like you're wishing me out of a job.
Well, I felt like, especially for me, I've been out of the telecom world a little bit. A lot of it was just like, all right, well, let's make more protocols for it's job security, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's even worse than like 3GPP and the real like wireless telecom stuff. Anyway, that's a different topic. All right, one other. This is a more general question, I guess, from anonymous. How can a dev build a career in WebRTC?
So is go build something and make sure to build something that that it's tied to, that the success is attributed back to you. So I had done open source, like I had worked on GStreamer and other projects like that, but it's very hard if you can't tie that success back to you. And so I've noticed that like people that go build interesting projects with Pion, that like it's very easy to turn that into a job if like be like you built this interesting self-contained project. Or I always encourage people that join Pion to go build this thing that I can say that like just you did, like this bandwidth estimation or this thing. Like it's make sure to like when you do open source not to just pick off small tickets, because you just don't get the appreciation or respect you deserve. Like as a developer, like I understand how hard that is, but it's just hard to convince interviewees or that like that's the thing. You don't get as much credit as you deserve. I don't know, that's and just say yes to everything. Like any Pion user that shows up, I say yes to their problem, and I never know where it's going to take me. Like how could I have ever imagined that like working on Pion 7 years ago would result in me having a job at OpenAI? I didn't plan any of this. I just kept saying yes to things, and then one day I wake up and like here I am.
Well, I guess no one really knew what OpenAI was like 5 years ago. But yeah, I get your point. All right, I did. We were chatting briefly. I told you I want to hold a conversation on embedded stuff. Actually, Vivek, I'll put his question up here, but he was a long one. But basically, asking about WebRTC for resource constrained embedded devices. I mean, I personally have been playing around with WebRTC on embedded devices and doing stuff, and that my post from a few weeks ago. Well, I don't know if you count the Raspberry Pi as an embedded device anymore, but kind of is, at least in that direction. But the use case there certainly is. I'm curious your thoughts. Well, one, we discussed about this, so I'll let you give your thoughts first, and I'll have some follow up too.
WebRTC is nice because you don't have to write anything on the client side. Like, you just exchange an offer and answer, and it goes. So that, like with WHIP, I think is what will help with WebRTC as the clear winner, because it had so. I guess the only other alternative would maybe be SIP, that could be like the winner for low latency comms. But I don't see anything that has like all of the right pieces to be the winner for low latency comms. It's like WebRTC is open source. It's not owned by anyone. It's like sub-second latency. It's got implementations everywhere. I think so. But you're asking like one of the most heavily biased people of all time. Like, all I do is WebRTC. So like, I think so, but you're asking the wrong. You should ask someone else.
There were. I mean, early on, I thought there'd be a lot more like WebRTC based IP cameras, and I think part of it is just that the stack is heavier to run it versus RTSP and stuff. But I did thought there'd be a lot more replacement of basically RTSP cameras with WebRTC. I haven't looked so deeply recently on this stuff, but I know. I mean, you pointed me. You can talk a little bit more about some of the even OpenAI embedded projects being able to run on an ESP like 32 device. But I mean, that's you mentioned that a bit in your 12 Days of Christmas video. I think in there you gave a little demo, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that too.
So, and back to the RTSP. So I have been around this problem for a while. So when I was at AWS, we worked on making like a pure C implementation for embedded cameras, and they were going after customers that were doing RTSP and RTMP because it's like not secure by default, and like but then it became a problem of like RTSP and RTMP are baked into the cameras. And so now I'm hoping with WHIP and WEP that we can that will get WebRTC into the cameras. And then there is a spec for what's the standard that cameras use for, there's like a specification, and the specification is adding WebRTC support. So like we'll have WebRTC in security cameras by default. Coming soon. I don't know. Like, I don't have like any of the insight into that industry. Like, I'm just a
ultimately it comes down to, I mean, the chip makers need to build something in. But I mean, I agree. At the WHIP stuff makes a big difference when and we're gonna just write to the WHIP interface. I suppose it'll start with the broadcast industry doing that for higher end encoders, and it'll make its way down to the cheaper IP cameras eventually, right?
So we'll see. And then you've got SRT that's floating around, and that seems like the only big competitor in that space. It's like really just like SRT versus WebRTC, and like I think SRT has already won in the big space because it has like, I mean, we'll see. Like, my opinion is like SRT has a behemoth behind it, and how long will that last? That's like big corporate Unixes. Like, eventually OnVIF. Yeah, there we go. That's the someone shared in the chat, the OnVIF WebRTC spec. I'm very excited for that. I think that like will be great for the future.
Okay, awesome. I'll highlight that for anyone who wants to click on it. All right, one more question. This looks like a long one. I didn't fully read it, so global question about LLM and WebRTC. Do you think LLMs will communicate with one another over WebRTC data channels? Could be a great way to make several LLMs work together. What are reviews about it? Extreme low latencies to communicate one LLM to another.
Yeah, so the way that it was explained to me is that like they're starting to picture LLMs as almost like your nervous system. Like you'll have like fast response LLMs, and they'll communicate with the slow ones. Having like a standardized communication between them is not anything anyone has talked about with me, because it's like here is a thing that doesn't even exist yet. What should be the communication between them? If you were like, I think it would be super interesting. I would love to see something like WebRTC, like an open standard, so you have like you can have like a beefy GPU box in your house and like different LLMs and throughout communicating through them. I don't know. Like it's always this problem is like, if you standardize something too early, it's not useful because you don't fully understand the problem. Compared to WebRTC is like a very clear problem set of like, oh, you're sending audio and video, and like it's easy to standardize that. But like I don't know how to standardize LLM communication. I guess the thing is, because I'm not like an AI person, I enjoy it. I love playing with it and I love learning about it, but I'm not the right person to be like, okay, this is the lingua franca of like LLMs.
Okay, but I guess when they want to do that, they'll come ask you, and
We'll
you'll let them know.
Yeah, I'll let you.
Okay. I know we gotta go back to work soon, so I think maybe I'll wrap it up here. I did, Sean. Do you have any like social media things, or I mean, people want to get a hold of you? What do you? Where you can put it in the chat there. I mean, so what I will say, well, people follow up. I'll stick it in when I republish the video. I'll include that stuff in there. But if you had anything, yeah, let me put that up.
I'd say those are the two big ones. Like, so the Discord is really nice because you can just come in and talk to everyone. But if you want to talk to me personally, send me an email. And then the Joe has this really nice thing where he has a channel just of interesting links. So I think if you join that Discord, then you'll see like WebRTC for the Curious and like the other implementations, all that stuff. Like I think that's a good jumping off point.
Okay. All right, and I'll put my stuff up there, but to Mac and let me paste my stuff in the channel also. My personal stuff and my. Oh, that's not working. Copy. It's weird. My clipboard stopped working.
Whoever's in charge of this, we gotta talk to whoever's in charge of this Ring Central stuff and
tell that guy should get fired.
Yeah, whoever the head honcho is over there on this WebRTC stuff is in trouble.
Well, all right. I mean, people found this and they got me, so they could always just respond there. So I'm not too worried about my part. Oh, I see why now. I missed the notification that I need to extend this by 15 minutes. That's
Do I get another WebRTC hack shirt? Because last time I realized you're wearing
it. Yeah, you're definitely worthy. I'll send you a code, and I guess that's a reminder that anyone here can. Well, I do have the merch. If you go to the WebRTC.com, there's merch stuff.
I didn't realize you had it open. I thought it was like something that I only got.
I did it at one time. I mean, I gave out stuff for all the past authors, right? Yeah. In there, but for anyone else to buy stuff, it's there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I gotta get more.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up. I always say, Sean, you always get me pumped up about WebRTC. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's sometimes you get down because it's like, oh, it's the same stuff. Or early on, obviously, whenever something's new, it's like new, exciting, and we're breaking the world. WebRTC now has penetrated the world, but it's exciting to see it get into like major use cases like OpenAI, and it's extra exciting to see that you're involved in it, and that you're still willing to make this WebRTC stuff. I don't know. Hopefully, you have other hobbies, but it seems like your sole hobby. This is great. Well, thank you for keeping me going. Right.
Yeah. No, I love it. Like it's you just always find new stuff, and that's the beauty of life. Like I feel so lucky to be here. Like I never imagined. Like I thought I would be stuck in Toledo, Ohio, my entire life. And like, I can't imagine that I get to work with all these things and talk to all these people. This was a way more colorful life than I ever thought I would have. And it's all thanks to open source and WebRTC. So I'm hooked.
Okay. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you again, and see you all next time.
Yep.